All right, this morning, if I read my schedule correctly and prepared, we're going through Luke 10 and looking at the parable of the Good Samaritan. And Theron was so excited that we're studying one of these lesser known parables this morning. Joke, everyone knows the story of the Good Samaritan. I think we used this video clip during VBS and the adult class. I think when Jeremy was here, he played the 4-minute clip on Jesus traveling from Jerusalem to Jericho and that place that he sets the parable. I'm not going to do that again this morning, but that's available on YouTube if you want to go see that and just see how barren it is and try to get a picture of the road and what it was like. Kind of setting the context as you read ahead, what's the setting of this parable? Okay, so spreading the word, and I think that's right, because earlier in the chapter, he's sent out the 72 to spread the word of the kingdom, 2 by 2, that's right. So they're going through and they're doing that. So it's kind of the traveling section of Luke. So it's kind of neat that you have this traveling parable set in the traveling section. Good point, Harry. Yep. Yeah, I want to focus on that for a few minutes. Because I don't want to miss the bigger point. Perry, would you mind reading 25 through 28 and kind of setting the context for us? Okay, so what's the first question that kind of prompts this whole story? Okay, it's not about serving people. The first question is about, what do I do to be right with God? It's a salvation question. Right? And the lawyer is asking that. Is he asking the question out of sincerity of heart? No. What does it say? Okay, in the first part here, he's seeking to test Jesus, right? So he's putting him to the test. Does Jesus answer him directly? Or does he do a very Jesus thing? He asks him a question. So he sets him up. What's the question Jesus asks the lawyer? Oh, Mr. Lawyer, you know how this goes. What does the law say about that? And how does the lawyer respond? How do you be right with God? Yeah. Yeah. So he puts together two passages from the law. He puts it together from Deuteronomy and Leviticus. So he synthesizes a couple of things. And he says, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and your neighbor as yourself. Jesus actually taught that during his ministry. Was that a good answer? That is the answer. Right? And Jesus even says that. Like, this whole section could have ended at verse 28. Because Jesus says, you've answered really well. You've answered correctly. Do this, you'll live. Do this, you'll have eternal life. But the lawyer didn't leave well enough alone, right? So you made the point. You see his attitude more, because what does he want to do next? He wants Jesus to give him an attaboy. And he wants Jesus to give him an attaboy publicly, because this is a public conversation. So he wants Jesus to acknowledge him. And he could have worded this so many different ways. He could have said, well, that's what I do. Instead, he tries to refine and say, well, who exactly is my neighbor? And what kind of response do you think he was expecting from Jesus? What was he hoping for? The two houses that are closest to you, those are your neighbors. As long as you do good to those, or maybe it shifts a little bit more, as long as you're good to your fellow Jew, like and taking care of other Israelites, you're fulfilling the law. But Jesus pushes him in his understanding here. So I want to come back to these two questions at the end. Remind me to do that if I don't do it. Right? Because it's not just about doing good. As Christians, why do I do good to my neighbor as a part of my salvation? Why do I do that? Yes. Right? It's not the cart before the horse. It's not I'm doing good to my neighbor so I can be right with God. But because God has been gracious toward me, I'm gracious toward my neighbor. So my goodness is connected to my salvation. And I don't know that we always make that connection when we talk about this parable. We just kind of jump into telling the story. Okay? Now, really quick before we get too far into the text, talk to me about the geographic setting for this parable. What do we know about Jerusalem and Jericho and the road between the two? Treacherous. Okay, yes. I would agree with that. What makes it so treacherous? I'll do a Jesus thing and ask you another question. Okay, so you've got about a couple thousand elevation foot drop from Jerusalem to Jericho. So you've got steep roads, first off. And then you've got this barren wilderness area in between. It gets really baking hot. You're heading toward the Dead Sea, so the lowest point on earth, super muggy, sweltering, not fun. And someone pointed this out in my reading this week. I didn't realize this. So Herod the Great built up Jericho, and he built up a palace down there. And when he was all done, he laid off tens of thousands of workers and laborers. And so you have all of these people who had been making money doing hard labor, and then they weren't, which kind of fed into the people that were supporting themselves through highway robbery. Okay. But what was one of the reasons that people kept going from Jerusalem to Jericho in the first century? Herod's got a palace over there. The Levites have quarters over there. The priests have quarters over there. So, they would go up to Jerusalem and do their work and do their job and serve in the temple. And then when they were done with their service, they'd go and, vacation and have their weekends in Jericho. So it was really normal for priests and Levites to be going back and forth between the two. So everything that Jesus says here in the story, these people have been like, oh yeah, that makes sense. Priest and Levite would be going from Jerusalem to Jericho. They just finished working. They've got their place over there. So everything that Jesus says in the story would fit and make sense to them. Okay. All right. So the lawyer seeking to justify himself, who is my neighbor? Jesus starts telling the story. Who is this man in verse 30? And what happens to him? Just got robbed? Beat up? How bad? Okay. Half dead is still mostly alive. Quoting Mad Max. They leave him on the side of the road. If this really happened, if this was real life, this guy gets beat up, left half dead on the side of the road from Jerusalem to Jericho, what is going to happen to him if no one intervenes? Just from exposure, he's going to die. It is hot and it's arid. From dehydration, he's going to die. If they beat him up bad enough, he's bleeding out. Okay, so things do not look good for this man. And we don't know anything else about the robbers. That's unimportant. Okay. Now, by chance, in verse 31, what happens? Okay, a priest shows up. What would you expect out of a priest? Why would you expect that? Okay, now people are starting to talk. Why would you expect that? Yeah. Okay. Okay, he's a good guy. All right. Anybody else? Why would you expect a priest to do that? Sure. So, as someone who knows God and his will theoretically the most, you would think he would do what God would want him to do. That, that's a fair assumption. Fair. Any other reasons why you would expect a priest to help? All right. Is anyone not surprised that the priest doesn't help? Darren's like, no, I'm not surprised at all. Good for nothing, priest. Why are you not surprised? Okay. Okay. Oh. Okay. So Theron brings up a really good point. Some of the obstacles that this priest might have felt. So the first, what we know from the priests, what we know about the priests from the Gospels is they were super legalistic. And if you go back to the law, you go back to Deuteronomy, you go back to Leviticus, what would happen if someone came into contact with a dead body? They became impure. This guy is half dead, which if you're not sure, he might look like he's dead. So as he goes down the road and he sees a mostly dead guy, he's like, if I touch him and he is dead, or if he comes into contact with blood, that will make him unclean. So he's like, if I get unclean, this is going to be so inconvenient. Like, it's going to ruin the next couple of days. I've got to go through purification rites, and I had plans to go party with my buddies in Jericho. So, like, I don't have time for this. I really don't have time for this. I'm not even going to check. We're just going to assume he's dead, and God would not want me to touch a dead body. Okay? That's one potential hurdle. Another potential hurdle, go back to verse 30. What do we know about this beaten man's nationality or identity? Oh, the beaten man. We don't. It doesn't say. Which means the priest doesn't know. You know, he doesn't know if he's a Jew. He doesn't know if he's a Samaritan. He doesn't know, he doesn't want to unintentionally come into contact with somebody that just by their ethnicity might make him impure. Okay. So, because of the great inconvenience of potentially helping, he probably used the law in his own mind to rationalize, I'm not going to be impure, I'm just going to keep on going. So he passes by on the other side. Anything you all want to add about the priests? I'm sorry? Useless. That's a good summary. He's useless. Which is sad considering he's a priest. Yeah. Yeah, like he could have done something. I mean, he did nothing. He did nothing. Actually, he did worse than nothing. He got further away. He stepped further away. Great points. Darren, go for it. Okay. So you're saying if there had been an audience, he probably would have been like, oh, wait a minute, let me help. Or you, boy, come over here. Right. Right. Oh, man. I don't think you're wrong, which is sad. Okay, so 31, Jesus introduces the priest, and he does worse than nothing. He passes by on the other side. Verse 32, he introduces a second character, the Levite. And what does the Levite do? Oh, no, not the Samaritan, the Levite. We've got the priest, the Levite. What does the Levite do? Passes by on the other side. What makes his even worse? Okay. Checks on him, gets closer, realizes he's still alive, passes by on the other side. And I would add this, someone suggested this. Jesus didn't say it, but maybe it's implied. That the first person is the priest. Let's assume that the Levite is following close enough that he sees the priest, kind of like Gawker's block on the freeway, where the priest is like, slows down, oh, yuck, kind of goes like this. So when the Levite gets closer, he's like, what did that guy say yuck about? Slows down even more, gawks a little bit longer, and then keeps going. What makes that worse? Yeah. So he had even more opportunity. It didn't just catch him by surprise. Like, he anticipated there was something there, enough to slow down, but still didn't stop. Yeah, it didn't help. Didn't help. In some ways, that makes him more culpable, more at guilt. And Jesus uses a character that they would have held in high standing and would have had great expectations of him. Okay? I don't know that we need to add a whole lot more to the Levite because he's kind of an intensification of the first of the priest. But anything else that you want to add or that you have questions about? That's a great point. Neither one of them showed any compassion. Right? They didn't try to put themselves in the place of that man. They didn't ask, if that was me, what would I want someone to do for me? Which is what Jesus taught over in Matthew 5 through 7. Right? So he didn't do that. Okay, so we're getting to the point in the parable where it takes the turn. Right? So the lawyer is there listening to this. The lawyer is the one who asked, who is my neighbor? Expecting Jesus to give him some kind of answer that would have made him look good. So the lawyer's there going, those are my buddies. Priest is I'm a lawyer. The priest is my buddy. The Levite's my buddy. And Jesus is not portraying my buddies in a very good light. If I were the lawyer, I'd probably start sweating about now. And then the story turns. So who does he introduce in 33? A Samaritan. Okay, tell me who the Samaritans are. What's that? Okay, they refer to them as dogs. Yeah, so half-breed. Yep. Yeah, that's exactly right. Where you have the Jews that were left in the land during the 70 years of exile, they intermarry with the Assyrians, and they become their own lesser Israel. And so the Israelites that do not intermarry, the Israelites who come back from captivity, will not have anything to do with them. And the Samaritans, as a people, get to the point where they're practicing a form of Judaism. Right? So we have a great example of this in John chapter 4 with the Samaritan woman. And she even talks to Jesus about their worship. She's like, you say you should worship in Jerusalem, but we worship on this mountain, which means they had a worship place on Mount Gerizim. They had their own temple on Mount Gerizim. And so when they had their Day of Atonement, they would go to Mount Gerizim, while the rest of the people, the Israelites, would go to Jerusalem. So the Israelites looked down on them and would not interact with them, really upset with them, and Jesus makes a Samaritan the hero. Right? He does something in verse 33 that the good religious Jewish boys wouldn't do. He journeys, he comes to the place where this beaten guy is, and when he sees him, what does he have that the other two didn't? That you've already pointed out. Compassion. Which means what? Yeah, the way we might say that is, I felt something within my heart, right? And we would use the heart as the seat of our emotions. In the first century, what they would have said is they felt for this person deep in their gut, right? Like, I hurt for them, and I hurt for them because they're hurting, and so I sympathize. And so because he sympathized, which is more like Jesus, because the Gospels always talk about Jesus seeing crowds and having compassion, right? So this Samaritan feels for people the way that Jesus feels for people. He has compassion. And so what does he do in 34, which is the opposite of the other two? He stops. He went to him. The other two go by on the other side of the road. Like, we're giving him more space. The Samaritan gets closer. Yeah. He does. It says he bound up his wounds. So I don't know what he's got with him. We don't know. Those are just details that we don't have because it's a story. But he binds up this guy's wounds. What does he pour? Oil and wine. Does anyone know what connection oil and wine had with the priests? Because oil and wine were used in priestly service. Yeah, so the wine would have been used to clean and purify, right? And the oil would have been used to salve and bring comfort, right? So the Samaritan is described as the one that has the oil and the wine, when the good Jewish people would have expected the priest and the Levite to have it. But the Samaritan has it and uses it. Then what does he do? Bandages him up and then puts him on his own animal. Yeah, he takes him to an inn, takes care of him at the inn. Does he stay there for forever? Okay, the next day he took out 2 denarii. So you break down what a day's wages were versus what this guy gives out. Basically, this guy gives out a week or 2 worth of lodging. It's not just a single night. He's actually giving him enough for multiple days. And what does he tell the innkeeper? Take care of this guy while I'm gone. If he needs more, when I get back, I'll pay you back. Right? So he's taking care of him, making provision for this guy. All right. Now we're not done making application. But Jesus concludes it. That's it. That's the story. And then he turns around to the lawyer who asked the question, who is my neighbor? What does he ask the neighbor? Or what does he ask the lawyer? Yeah, he asks him, who do you think proved to be a neighbor? Who proved to be a neighbor? And the answer was, the one who showed mercy. And then Jesus repeats himself from verse 28, then go and do likewise. So, if Mr. Rogers was sitting here, and you asked him the question, so who is your neighbor? What would Mr. Rogers say? Everyone. Everyone that you have the ability to be a neighbor to is your neighbor. It doesn't have to do with how close, like if we were figuring out who is my neighbor. Theron, he's my closest neighbor. But whoever's sitting in the back, they're my neighbor too. It has nothing to do with proximity. It has everything to do with who am I able to serve? Who can I serve? Now bring it back to the first question that the lawyer asks. What does that have to do with salvation? Do I do good to my neighbors in order to receive salvation? Amen. Yes. Yeah, I think the observation that we make with the scribes and the Pharisees and the Sadducees and all of those people that served in a religious sense in the first century is they may have had an academic understanding of the law, but they did not keep the heart of it at all. And I know that's a really big, broad brush that I'm painting with. They knew the text, but they didn't know how to apply it and live it, right? And so Jesus is trying to bring the two together. Josh? Yeah. Mhm. Yeah. Amen. Good point. There was something I meant to add in here that this part of the discussion reminded me of. I want to back up just for a second. And I want to talk about the potential dynamic between the priest and the Levite, where you have the priest introduced first and potentially the Levite following the example of the priest, right? We need to be thinking about how our responses and the way that we live and what we say, the effect that that has on the people who are watching us and coming behind us, right? So I feel like I'm the oldest of a bajillion kids. I'm one of seven, the oldest of seven. And there were times where me and one of my brothers or multiple of my brothers would get in trouble. And my mom would start with the youngest, why did you do what you did? Well, because I saw so and so, and I saw so and so. And there was some legitimacy to that. But she would end up saying, you may have followed the example, but, you made your own choices. But then when it would get to the oldest, do you realize that you set the example? Like you set the tone here. Now, they're responsible for them, but if they're following you, then you have a greater responsibility because they're following you, right? And so I want to make sure we think about that. What kind of example are we setting for the people that are following us in discipleship? Okay, there's another application I want to make here in just a minute, but come back toward the end. What application do you all think we can make from the parable of the Good Samaritan? Yeah. Yes. Yeah, so if someone asks you to go 1 mile, go with them 2, right? Go above and beyond. That's what God did for us. Great. I see another hand over here. Yeah, Dale? I've had that discussion recently. Yes. Yeah. Yes. Yes. Yes, ma'am. Oh, yeah. I know you. Right. Yeah. Yeah. Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Think about what got said earlier in class with the priest and the Levite. The least they could have done was get to town and send somebody back, right? The Samaritan had the funds that he could have passed by, gotten into town, paid somebody, and gone back. But he actually slows down and gets his hands dirty and binds this guy's wounds himself, interrupts whatever he's doing in the middle of the day, and helps out personally before delegating to somebody else. And I think that kind of goes along with the point that you're making. Harry? Yeah. The kingdom is upside down. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Thank you for helping us categorize that and think through that. Um, let's look at one more New Testament text to make a connection that I didn't see until a few years ago. I want to emphasize a word that's used twice here in the parable, and then I want you to be listening for it when we go to the next text. Okay, so in verses 34 and 35, what is the verb that Jesus uses to describe what the Samaritan does? Care. It says he took care of him at the end of verse 34. And that's the instruction he gave the innkeeper. Take care of him. All right. Same word, same verb. Now go over to 1 Timothy chapter 3. And when normally we say 1 Timothy chapter 3, why are we going there? Okay, talk about elders and deacons, right? I'm going to read down through the description of elders here, and I want you to listen for that verb. Okay, I'm going to start in verse 1. The saying is trustworthy. If anyone aspires to the office of overseer, he desires a noble task. Therefore, an overseer must be above reproach, the husband of one wife, sober-minded, self-controlled, respectable, hospitable, able to teach, not a drunkard, not violent but gentle, not quarrelsome, not a lover of money. He must manage his own household well, with all dignity keeping his children submissive. For if someone does not know how to manage his own household, how will he care for God's church? He must not be a recent convert, or he may become puffed up with conceit and fall into the condemnation of the devil. Moreover, he must be well thought of by outsiders so that he may not fall into disgrace, into a snare of the devil. I tried not to emphasize the word with my voice. I don't know how well I did. But did you see it? Where was it? Okay, it was in verse 5. Same verb. Same verb. And in verses 4 and 5, he's actually using it to describe something else. Starting in verse 4, an elder must what? Manage his own household. Look at verse 5. For if someone does not know how to manage his own household, how will he care for God's church? Here in 1 Timothy, Paul is equating biblical, scriptural management with care. So when we hear the word management, what do we think of? What's a manager? Okay, we think of somebody that's high up in the chain of command, right? They get the parking space out front with their name there, and they get special seat, and they get special service, and they get perks, extra vacation time. They have less responsibility because they get to boss people around and micromanage. Like, that's just the picture we get, right? But is that what Paul is saying here? What does he say biblical management is? Stewardship. It's the guy who's the good Samaritan. It's the guy who's getting close when he sees a mess. And it's the guy who's willing to bind up when he's able to bind up. And it's the guy who's delegating to the innkeeper, even at his own cost, if that's what he's got to do. But back here in the text, how do you know in 1 Timothy 3, how do you know if a man can care and manage for a church that way? What's the proving ground? Okay, he's doing it in his home life. Right? He's doing it in his home life, where if he sees a mess, he doesn't go on the far side of the road. He actually gets closer. And as best as he's able, he gets his hands dirty trying to help. And if he's not able to do it, he'll delegate and bring an innkeeper in to do what he might not be able to do at great expense to himself. Does that make sense? It's a beautiful picture when you see the similarity in the verb in 1 Timothy 3 with Luke 10. Like, it's super instructive to us. So as husbands and as fathers, whether we ever become elders or not, like, that's what we should be shooting for in our homes. We're to the point of trying to make application of the parable, right? So if I want to make application to the parable in Jeremy Dehut's family, this is how I want to manage. I want to care for them. I want to step in when they need me to. I want to sacrifice. And if I can't do the job, I'm going to bring someone in who can. Does that make sense? What do y'all think about that? Have you seen that connection before? Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, you're not the guy with the whip driving from the back. You're the guy in amongst and in front trying to lead the way, right? Yes, that's exactly right. And when you see somebody that falls into a ditch, you're the one right beside them. Exactly. Anybody else? What do you think about all that? Yeah. They're already doing it. They're already doing it. Great point, Dale. Yeah. New twist. Yeah. Huh. Yeah. And maybe let's flip it for a second, because we've been talking about jumping in and helping someone, helping someone. Guess what? At some point, we're all going to be the guy beat up dead on the side of the road. Like at some point, we're going to be the one that someone needs to jump in and help. And when that happens, we need to be humble and accept the service that people are offering us. And that's going to happen more than once in our life. We're going to take turns helping people and being helped, right? So going back to the scriptures that the lawyer quoted, he was right. He just wasn't applying it. We want to love God with all that we've got and love other people. That's what we do to the best that we're able to. And people are going to be in different positions and ability to help, but we just want to do what we can out of our love for God and love for each other. I think that's about time, y'all. So thank you for your participation and reading ahead. And we'll jump into another one next week.